Custer County, Nebraska. October 1888. While his neighbors stacked sod bricks in the traditional manner their fathers had taught them, Jacob Steiner was building something the prairie had never seen. They called it foolish. They called it dangerous. Some called it an insult to every honest homesteader who'd survived a Great Plains winter. He was wrapping his family's shelter in walls of compressed straw. What did this German immigrant understand about thermal physics that experienced American settlers had missed? And why were the very people who mocked him about to beg for a secret? Before we reveal how Jacob's madness became the blueprint that saved lives across 3 counties, do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button, because in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to show you survival engineering so effective that modern architects are rediscovering it 140 years later. And I want you here when we explore more forgotten wisdom that could change how you think about shelter, heat, and survival itself. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's dive into one of history's most vindicated gambles. The Great Plains in 1888 offered settlers 2 choices for shelter: dugouts carved into hillsides or sod houses built from prairie earth itself. Both methods had sustained homesteaders for decades. The thickness of sod walls, typically 24 to 36 inches, provided mass enough to moderate temperature swings. Experienced builders knew exactly how to cut blocks, how to layer them, how to seal the gaps. Jacob Steiner had studied these methods for 3 months after arriving from Baden-Württemberg. He'd helped neighbors raise 2 sod houses. He understood the logic, but he also understood something else. In the Black Forest, his grandfather had insulated alpine barns with loose straw packed between timber frames. The livestock's body heat, trapped by that insulation, had kept water from freezing even when external temperatures dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Jacob had spent winters in those barns. He remembered the remarkable stillness of the air, the way cold simply stopped at the wall. So when he filed his homestead claim in April 1888, he made a decision that would define his family's survival and his community's opinion of him for years to come. He would build a hybrid structure, a sod house with double walls, and the cavity between them packed solid with wheat straw compressed to 12 pounds per cubic foot. Thomas Bradley, the settlement's most respected builder, watched Jacob stake out his foundation with visible disapproval. "Straws for bedding and feed," Bradley said, tobacco working in his cheek. "You put in walls, mice will nest. It'll rot with the first rain that seeps through. And God help you if sparks find it." Jacob nodded politely. His English was still uncertain, but he'd understood every word. He continued measuring. By late May, the mockery had spread through every homestead within 10 miles. Women mentioned it while trading eggs. Men brought it up during barn raisings, shaking their heads. That German fellow was packing his walls with hay. As if prairie winters weren't brutal enough without inviting fire and vermin into the very bones of your house. Steiner's haystack, they called it. Some predicted he'd abandon it by July. Others wagered his family would be sleeping in a neighbor's home come December. Their fool's experiment either burned, rotted, or overrun. Jacob kept building. He cut sod blocks 18 inches deep, standard practice. But he laid them in 2 parallel walls with a 16-inch gap between them. Into that gap went wheat straw, not loose, but tramped down in 6-inch layers with a tamping pole he'd fashioned from oak. Each layer compressed before the next went in. The work was backbreaking. His wife Anna helped, and their 2 children, aged 8 and 6, carried armfuls of straw from the stack. By September, the structure stood complete. Outer walls of sod 18 inches thick, an air-in straw cavity 16 inches wide. Inner walls of sod another 18 inches thick. Total wall thickness 52 inches. The roof followed conventional design. Sod laid over willow branches, but Jacob had insulated the ceiling cavity too, packing it with 8 inches of compressed straw. When Thomas Bradley inspected the finished house in early October, his assessment was blunt. "You've built a tinder pile with living quarters attached. First lightning strike, first chimney spark, you'll burn alive in there. And if fire doesn't take you, the mice will drive you mad by December." Jacob's response was quiet. "We will see what winter says." What Jacob Steiner had created was, in modern terminology, a super-insulated thermal envelope with an R value that wouldn't be matched by conventional American construction for another 90 years. But he didn't know those terms. He knew only what his grandfather had taught him, that still air is among nature's finest insulators, and that organic materials, properly compressed and protected from moisture, could trap that still air in millions of tiny pockets. The physics were elegant. Sod, dense and heavy, provided thermal mass, the capacity to absorb and slowly release heat. Its R value per inch hovered around 1.0, respectable for the era. But 52 inches of sod alone would have been impractical to construct and maintain. The straw changed everything. Compressed wheat straw, protected from weather by those thick sod walls, delivered an R value between 2.5 and 3.0 per inch. That 16-inch cavity provided an insulation value of roughly R40 to R48. The inner and outer sod walls added another R36 combined. Total wall assembly R value, approximately R76 to R84. For context, a typical sod house of the period, with 24-inch walls, delivered about R24. Jacob's design provided more than 3 times the insulation value. And because the straw cavity was sealed on both sides by dense sod, moisture infiltration was minimal. Air movement was essentially zero. But autumn in Nebraska offered no test of these numbers. Daytime temperatures in October ranged from 55 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Nights dropped to the 30s and 40s. Jacob's family kept a small fire in their cast-iron stove each evening, more for cooking than heating. The interior temperature held steady between 62 degrees Fahrenheit and 68 degrees Fahrenheit with minimal fuel consumption. His neighbors burned similar amounts of wood, saw similar comfort levels. Nothing dramatic distinguished Jacob's house yet. If anything, the thickness of his walls made the interior noticeably darker, windows being necessarily deep set. Some visitors found the rooms gloomy. Thomas Bradley visited again in late October, bringing 2 other experienced builders with him. They examined the straw-packed walls, checked for moisture, looked for evidence of rodent intrusion. They found none. The straw showed no rot, no nesting. But Bradley wasn't impressed. "October's kind," he said. "You're burning the same wood we are. Maybe less, but not enough to matter. Wait until January. Wait until you're feeding that stove every 2 hours just to keep from freezing, and that straw's sucked up humidity all winter, and it starts composting inside your walls." One of the other builders, a Norwegian named Olsen who'd survived 7 Dakota winters, was more direct. "Sod works because it's simple. Proven. Your grandfather's alpine barns. Sure, maybe straw worked there. But this is the plains. Different snow, different wind, different cold. You've overcomplicated it. And complicated things fail." Jacob listened without argument. Anna served coffee. The men left shaking their heads, convinced that pride and old-world stubbornness would teach this immigrant a hard lesson before spring. What they didn't know was that Jacob had been recording data. Each morning and evening, he noted the outdoor temperature using a mercury thermometer purchased in Omaha, and he tracked how much wood he burned. His neighbors considered this fastidiousness peculiar, another European eccentricity. But Jacob understood something they didn't. If his design failed, he needed to know why. And if it succeeded, he needed proof. If you're finding value in this engineering breakdown, hit that like button right now. And drop a comment. What traditional building method from your region do you think modern construction has forgotten? Let's learn from each other. November brought the first hard freezes. Morning temperatures fell into the teens. Snow dusted the prairie 3 times, melting by afternoon. The homesteaders prepared, checking livestock shelters, stacking firewood, inventorying food supplies. Jacob's wood consumption remained notably lower than his neighbors. While families in conventional sod houses burned through a half-cord per week to maintain comfort, Jacob's carefully compressed straw walls required less than a third of that. The cast-iron stove in his front room, fired in the morning and again in the evening, kept the interior temperature between 64 degrees Fahrenheit and 70 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the day. Anna noticed something else. In their previous temporary dugout shelter, and in neighbors' homes she visited, Moisture was a constant problem. Condensation formed on walls during cold snaps. Bedding felt damp. The air carried a persistent chill that no amount of fire could fully banish. Jacob's house felt different. The air was dry. The walls, despite their thickness, never showed condensation on the interior surface. The children played on the floor without complaint of cold. Word of this performance spread slowly. Some neighbors attributed it to Jacob's smaller living space. Others suggested he was simply burning more wood than he admitted. A few speculated that the family was toughing out lower temperatures out of immigrant pride. But the wood pile told a different story. It sat in plain view, and by late November, it was clear that Jacob had consumed far less fuel than comparable households. Thomas Bradley, passing by on a supply run to town, stopped to examine the diminished pile. He did the math in his head, looked at the house, then at Jacob chopping kindling. "You're burning a third of what I am," Bradley said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it carried disbelief. "Yes," Jacob replied. "How are you keeping warm?" Jacob gestured at the walls. "The straw. It holds the heat inside." Bradley frowned. "Sod does that. Sod holds some. Straw holds more. You're saying those hay bales are why you're burning less wood?" "I'm saying it, yes." Bradley spat tobacco juice into the snow. "Won't matter come January. Real cold's different. You'll see." But others were less certain now. Olsen, the Norwegian, visited in early December under the pretense of borrowing a tool. Inside Jacob's house, he removed his coat within 2 minutes. In his own home, he kept his coat on until the stove had burned for an hour. "It is warm," Olsen admitted. "Very warm." "The walls," Jacob said simply. Olsen pressed his palm against the interior sod surface. It was cool to the touch, but not cold. No moisture. No frost. "How thick is the straw?" 16 inches. "Compressed hard. And no mice." "No mice." Olsen left thoughtful. He mentioned his visit to 2 other families. The consensus was shifting from mockery to cautious curiosity. Perhaps the Germans' design wasn't foolish. Perhaps it was simply different. Effective, even in its strange way. But effective in November and effective in January were different propositions on the Great Plains. Everyone knew this. Real winter, the kind that killed livestock, split trees, drove families to huddle together under every blanket they owned, that winter hadn't arrived yet. Thomas Bradley continued to predict failure. "It's coming," he told anyone who'd listen. "The big cold. Always does. And we'll see whose walls hold up." He was right about one thing. It was coming. January 9th, 1889. The barometric pressure had been dropping for 2 days. Experienced plainsmen recognized the signs. A peculiar stillness in the air, a yellowish cast to the afternoon sky, the way livestock grew restless and huddled. By evening, the wind arrived. Not gradually, but as a sudden assault from the northwest, carrying temperatures that plunged from 18 degrees Fahrenheit at sunset to -4 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight. Snow came horizontal, fine as flour, driven so hard it found every crack, every gap, every imperfection in every structure across Custer County. This was a plains blizzard of the kind that entered homesteader folklore. The kind that killed children lost between house and barn. The kind that suffocated cattle where they stood, encasing them in drifts. The kind that revealed which shelters had been built with wisdom and which with hope. In conventional sod houses, families fought for survival against the cold. The dense earthen walls, so effective in moderate weather, became thermal drains as exterior temperatures dropped to -12 degrees Fahrenheit by 2 a.m. and continued falling. Frost formed on interior walls. Families burned wood frantically. A full cord between sunset and dawn wasn't unusual, just to maintain temperatures above freezing inside. Thomas Bradley's household, among the best built in the settlement, maintained an interior temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit despite running their stove continuously and burning through 3 days' worth of firewood in a single night. His children slept fully dressed under piles of blankets. His wife kept water near the stove to prevent it from freezing solid. Olsen's family faced worse. His older structure, built 5 years prior, had developed small gaps in the sod walls. normal settling, nothing that mattered in October. In January, those gaps bled heat like open wounds. Interior temperature, 34 degrees Fahrenheit, despite burning furniture to supplement their depleted wood supply. 3 families abandoned their homes entirely, seeking shelter with better supplied neighbors. 2 homesteads saw fires burn out of control when desperate inhabitants overfired their stoves. 1 family escaped with minor burns, the other lost everything. Inside Jacob Steiner's straw-insulated fortress, a different story unfolded. At 10 p.m. on January 9th, with exterior temperature at -8 degrees Fahrenheit and falling, Jacob recorded his interior temperature, 66 degrees Fahrenheit. The cast iron stove burned steadily, consuming wood at the same rate it had in November. The children slept in their night clothes. Anna worked at the kitchen table without shawl or blanket. By 2 a.m., exterior temperature reached -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior, 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Jacob added wood to the stove, his second firing of the night, on schedule with his normal routine. At dawn on January 10th, the blizzard peaked. Exterior temperature, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind speed exceeded 40 miles per hour. Snowdrifts buried fences, covered windows, transformed the landscape into a featureless white hell. Interior temperature in Jacob's house, 63 degrees Fahrenheit. He was burning wood at approximately 1/3 the rate of his neighbors. The straw-packed walls, compressed and sealed, had created a thermal barrier so effective that even extreme cold could barely penetrate. The massive sod layers on either side of that insulation absorbed what little heat escaped from the living space and radiated it slowly back inward. The ceiling's 8-inch straw layer prevented heat loss upward. The physics worked exactly as Jacob had predicted. Still air, trapped in millions of straw fiber pockets, resisted heat transfer. The dense sod prevented air infiltration and provided thermal mass. Together, they created a shelter that maintained stable interior temperature with minimal energy input. Around mid-morning, a desperate pounding came at the door. Thomas Bradley stood outside, his face raw from windburn, ice in his beard. Olson's fire went out, he shouted over the wind. His family's freezing. Can they shelter here? Jacob pulled the door wide. Of course. Bring them. Within an hour, 13 people crowded into Jacob's front room. Olson's family of 5, Bradley's wife, and 3 children. Thomas himself returning to tend his livestock. 2 single homesteaders whose small dugouts had proven uninhabitable. Even with 13 bodies in a space designed for 4, the interior temperature climbed only to 71 degrees Fahrenheit. The straw walls absorbed the excess heat without allowing it to escape. No one wore coats. Children played without shivering. Coffee stayed hot on the table without requiring the stove surface. Anna Steiner served bread and soup. Olson sat near the stove, not because he needed its direct heat, but because the habit of seeking warmth died hard. His wife wept quietly, not from cold now, but from relief. "Ow," Olson asked finally, staring at the thick walls. "How is it this warm?" Jacob smiled slightly. "The straw. I told you. It holds the heat inside." "We laughed at you," Olson said. "Yes, you did." The blizzard raged for 32 hours. When it finally broke on the afternoon of January 11th, the temperature had reached -26 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest reading in Custer County's recorded history. Jacob's household had burned 18 cubic feet of wood. Thomas Bradley, in a comparable-sized structure, had burned 64 cubic feet. Olson had burned 52 cubic feet before his fire died. And still Jacob's house stood warmer. Subscribe right now if you want to see how this German immigrant's foolish design changed frontier architecture forever. Comment below, what's the coldest temperature you've ever had to survive? And how did your shelter hold up? Let's hear your stories. January 12th, 1889. The wind died at dawn, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt unnatural. The sun rose over a transformed landscape. Drifts 20 feet high, fences buried, entire structures reduced to white mounds that revealed themselves only by their shadows. Thomas Bradley emerged from his house at first light, exhausted from a night of constant stoking. His wood supply, carefully calculated to last until March, had been decimated. 3 cords remained where 5 should have stood. His children were safe, but pale and listless from the cold. His wife's hands showed early signs of frostbite despite never leaving the interior. He walked the quarter-mile to Jacob Steiner's house, fighting through hip-deep snow. The structure stood clean-lined and intact, smoke rising steadily from its chimney. Not the frantic black smoke of an overfired stove, but the thin gray of a fire burning efficiently at normal draft. Bradley knocked. Jacob answered in his shirt sleeves. The interior warmth hit Bradley like a physical force. He stepped inside, blinking, removing his hat. 13 people had sheltered here through the worst night in recent memory, and the space felt comfortable, lived in, warm. Not hot, not the desperate, wood-devouring heat of a battling stove, but genuinely, sustainably warm. Olson's family was preparing to return home. The children looked rested. Anna Steiner was baking bread, the simple act itself a testament to the house's stable temperature. In Bradley's home, his wife hadn't dared open the stove long enough to bake anything. "What's your interior temperature?" Bradley asked. Jacob checked his thermometer. 65 degrees. Right now? After that night? Yes. It dropped to 63 during the coldest hours. The fire brought it back up. Bradley stared at the thick walls. "How much wood did you burn?" 18 cubic feet. Maybe 20. I haven't finished measuring. Bradley had burned 64. More than 3 times as much. And his house had never exceeded 40 degrees inside. The mathematics were irrefutable. The evidence was empirical. The mockery died in Bradley's throat, replaced by something harder to swallow. The realization that his expertise, his years of experience, his confidence in traditional methods had been comprehensively wrong. "I need to understand this," he said quietly. "Will you show me?" Jacob nodded. Over the next hour, he explained the design in detail. The compressed straw, the double-wall, sod construction, the vapor barrier created by the dense earth on both sides, the thermal mass effect, the elimination of air infiltration. Bradley listened without interrupting. Olson stayed to hear it again, taking mental notes. By the time Jacob finished, 2 other homesteaders had arrived, drawn by the smoke and the gathering. "Can this be added to existing houses?" Olson asked. "Difficult," Jacob admitted. "The walls must be built together. But for new construction, yes. Or for major repairs after the old walls fail." "How much does the straw cost?" "Only labor. Wheat straw is everywhere. You must compress it hard, keep it dry. The sod protects it. And mice? None. The compression leaves no space. The sod prevents entry. In 18 months, I have seen none." Bradley ran his hand along the interior wall. "Cool but not cold. Dry. Solid. We called you a fool," he said. "Yes," Jacob replied. "You did. I was wrong." Those 3 words, from Thomas Bradley, the settlement's master builder, the man whose opinion had shaped community consensus, changed everything. By January 15th, 11 homesteaders had visited Jacob's house to examine the construction. By January 20th, Bradley himself was sketching plans for a straw-insulated addition to his own structure. By February 1st, 3 families had begun gathering materials to build new shelters using Jacob's method. The empirical data was undeniable. In equivalent conditions, Jacob's design delivered. Interior temperatures 25 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit higher than conventional construction, fuel consumption reduced by 65 to 70% stable thermal performance across a 48 degrees Fahrenheit exterior temperature swing, minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. No moisture accumulation, no pest intrusion, no structural degradation. Construction cost within 15% of traditional methods. Additional labor offset by free straw. The blizzard had provided a controlled experiment with stakes measured in survival. Jacob's hypothesis that properly compressed organic insulation, sealed within protective thermal mass, could outperform standard frontier construction had been proven beyond dispute. But the transformation went deeper than engineering. It touched something more fundamental, the question of whose knowledge deserved respect. Jacob Steiner was an immigrant. He spoke broken English. He'd arrived with old-world ideas that seemed archaic to American-born settlers confident in their frontier wisdom. The community's initial dismissal hadn't been based solely on technical skepticism. It had carried undertones of cultural superiority, the assumption that American methods forged in American conditions must naturally surpass anything a German farmer remembered from alpine barns. The blizzard cared nothing for those assumptions. Physics respected no national borders. Heat transfer, thermal mass, insulation values. These operated according to laws that predated nations and would outlast them. Jacob's walls hadn't saved his family through American ingenuity or German stubbornness. They'd saved them through simple, testable, reproducible engineering that worked because the principles were sound. If this story is challenging how you think about traditional knowledge and modern expertise, smash that like button and comment. What's one old-fashioned technique you've discovered actually works better than the modern replacement? Let's share that wisdom. By late 1889, 17 homesteads within 50 miles of Jacob Steiner's claim had incorporated straw insulation into their construction. Not all followed his design exactly. Some used thinner cavities, others experimented with different materials, but the core principle had taken root. Thomas Bradley, whose public acknowledgement had legitimized the technique, built 2 houses that year using modified versions of Jacob's method. He developed refinements, strategies for ensuring proper compression, techniques for preventing settling, methods for integrating the design with different roof styles. He credited Jacob in every conversation, a humility that enhanced rather than diminished his reputation. The winter of 1889 to 1890 tested the new constructions thoroughly. Temperatures dropped below zero 14 times between December and February. Every straw-insulated structure outperformed traditional designs by measurable margins. Fuel savings ranged from 40% to 70%, depending on execution quality. Interior temperatures stayed 15 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. By 1891, the technique had spread to 3 counties. Itinerant builders learned the method and carried it with them. Agricultural extension agents, newly established by the land-grant universities, documented the design in their reports. The Nebraska State Board of Agriculture published specifications in their 1892 handbook, citing Jacob Steiner by name. The phrase Steiner's method entered local vocabulary. Newspaper accounts from the period describe it matter-of-factly, without the mockery that had greeted its introduction. A Custer County newspaper from March 1893 includes this notice. J. Steiner of Section 12 reports excellent results from his straw-insulated construction through second winter. Interior temperatures maintained at 65 to 68 degrees, with 1/2 cord fuel consumption compared to neighboring conventional structures, consuming 1 1/2 cords for inferior results. Method recommended for adoption by incoming settlers. But the broader architectural establishment was slower to embrace the innovation. Urban builders, working with milled lumber and coal heating, saw little application for a technique born of prairie necessity. When homesteading declined after 1900 and rural populations gravitated toward towns, straw bale construction faded from general practice. The knowledge didn't disappear. It survived in scattered rural communities, passed between families, documented in county extension files, but ceased to be widely known or practiced. Until the 1970s. Energy crisis, oil embargoes, skyrocketing heating costs. Suddenly, engineers and architects began questioning assumptions about insulation, thermal efficiency, and construction materials. Researchers explored alternative building methods. They discovered, often with surprise, that various primitive techniques delivered performance superior to modern standard practice. Straw bale construction was rediscovered, not as a historical curiosity, but as a legitimate, effective building method with measurable advantages. Modern testing confirmed what Jacob Steiner had demonstrated empirically in 1889. Properly installed straw bale walls deliver R values between R40 and R60, require minimal embodied energy to produce, use agricultural waste as primary material, and perform reliably for decades when protected from moisture. Today, thousands of straw bale structures exist across North America and Europe. Building codes in multiple states explicitly accommodate the method. Engineering specifications exist. Insurance companies provide coverage. The technique Jacob's neighbors once called foolish is now taught in sustainable architecture programs at major universities. The irony is profound. Modern builders market straw bale construction as innovative, cutting-edge, environmentally progressive. They're right about its benefits. But the innovation occurred in 1888 in Custer County, Nebraska, by a German immigrant whose neighbors initially laughed at him. What changed wasn't the physics. Our values don't evolve. Thermal mass doesn't improve with time. What changed was willingness to question assumptions, to test rather than dismiss, to respect knowledge regardless of its source. Jacob Steiner lived until 1923. He never claimed to have invented straw insulation. He freely credited his grandfather's alpine barn techniques and acknowledged similar methods existed in other cultures. He built 4 more houses using his method and helped neighbors with their construction. In his later years, county agricultural agents interviewed him about his techniques, and his detailed explanations were preserved in extension records. He died in the same house he'd built in 1888. The structure stood for another 42 years after his death, finally succumbing not to structural failure, but to abandonment during the Depression. When it was dismantled in 1965, the straw insulation, after 77 years, showed no significant deterioration. The compression had held. No rot was evident. The material had simply done its job, decade after decade, exactly as Jacob had predicted. The final measurement, taken by a Curious County Historical Society member in 1964, found the insulation cavity still delivering approximately R43. 76 years. R43. From compressed wheat straw and sod. The modern lesson isn't just about insulation or frontier construction. It's about the dangerous comfort of dismissing what we don't immediately understand. About the cost of assuming our current methods represent the peak of possible knowledge. About the humility required to learn from sources that don't match our expectations. Thomas Bradley learned that lesson at -26 degrees Fahrenheit, standing in Jacob Steiner's warm house while his own children shivered a quarter-mile away. The community learned it through that brutal winter. And we're still learning it today, rediscovering techniques that were never actually lost, only ignored. They laughed at his Hay-Bale fortress. They called it primitive, dangerous, foolish. They were certain their conventional wisdom, tested by years of frontier experience, must prevail over one immigrant's eccentric experiment. Winter didn't laugh. Physics doesn't care about consensus. And Jacob Steiner's family stayed warm while others froze, not through luck or stubbornness, but through sound engineering that worked exactly as designed. The next time someone dismisses a traditional technique as outdated or assumes modern methods must be superior simply because they're modern, remember this. Sometimes the only thing primitive is our willingness to learn. Before you go, do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel because we're diving into more forgotten survival wisdom that modern science is only now validating. Second, hit that like button if this story changed how you think about traditional knowledge. And third, drop a comment. What's one traditional technique from your culture or region that deserves more respect? Let's build a library of forgotten wisdom together. Jacob Steiner proved that the best innovations often aren't innovations at all. They're just old knowledge, patiently waiting for us to stop laughing and start listening. This script presents historical building techniques for educational purposes. Modern construction requires adherence to current building codes, engineering standards, and professional consultation. Historical methods described should not be attempted without proper research, permits, and expert guidance.